It was a cold February day in the year 2002 when the bells of St. George's Chapel tolled for Princess Margaret, the younger sister of Queen Elizabeth II. The air hung heavy with sorrow, though not of the kind that accompanies the passing of a great monarch, but of a more fragile kind, reserved for a life that had glittered and faded with equal brilliance. As the coffin was carried beneath the vaulted stone arches, there was no grand proclamation, no final thunder of triumph, only the soft murmur of hymns, the shuffle of footsteps, and the fragrance of white lilies scattered as though to mask a life once lived in defiance of order. In that moment, the world remembered her not as an heir to power, but as the restless soul of the House of Windsor, whose fate was neither simple nor serene, whose choices burned brightly, yet left behind shadows that stretched long after her departure. Welcome, dear listener. Tonight we gather across time and distance, you in your place and I in mine, sharing the story of Princess Margaret, the rebel royal. Tell us, if you will, when and where you listen, so that we may weave your presence into this great tapestry of remembrance. And do not forget, if you wish this circle of memory to grow, to press the subscribe button and help carry these stories onward, from one listening heart to another. The child was born in the soft autumn of 1930 in Glamis Castle, Scotland, a place where grey stone rose high above the gardens and the mists of the highlands drifted through the trees. She was christened Margaret Rose, the second daughter of the Duke and Duchess of York, and though few could have known it then, she would live her life forever in the shadow of her elder sister, Elizabeth. The castle walls heard her first cries, and within those walls she learned to toddle, to laugh, to clasp tiny fingers around the world she would never truly be free to hold. The corridors smelled faintly of peat fires and polished wood, and the air rang with the sound of nursery rhymes sung by nannies who did not yet know the destiny of the children they tended. Elizabeth, 2 years her senior, was steady, calm, already marked by a gravity that made those around her pause in quiet respect. Margaret was different. Where Elizabeth sat still, Margaret fidgeted. Where Elizabeth's voice was gentle, Margaret's carried a note of mischief. Together they played in the garden paths, their white stockings smudged with soil, their laughter echoing against the stone facade. Theirs was a childhood that seemed to belong to another age, free of modern burdens, shielded by privilege, yet not yet enclosed by crown and expectation. But even within that gentle rhythm of nursery life, there was a whisper of hierarchy. Elizabeth was the elder, the natural leader. Margaret learned early to follow, to please, to charm, to sparkle in ways that would bring her attention of her own. And yet, for those first years, the burden was light. She was not destined to rule, nor expected to. She was the second child, beloved but peripheral, free in ways her sister could not be. The 1930s were restless years for Britain, but the two princesses, as they came to be called, lived under a careful dome of innocence. They were educated at home, tended by governesses, their world contained within palaces and castles. But the world beyond those walls began to stir with the murmurs of conflict, and the first cracks in their sheltered existence began to show. When their father unexpectedly became king in 1936, after the abdication of Edward VIII, the sisters' lives changed. The crown fell on Elizabeth's horizon, and Margaret's position altered forever. She was no longer merely the second daughter of a duke. She was now the sister of the heir presumptive, a role that held neither clarity nor freedom. She was still a child when London felt the tremors of war. In 1939, the sirens wailed across the city, and blackouts darkened the streets. The princesses were moved to Windsor Castle, where the thick walls promised safety against the bombs that rattled the night. The sound of sirens haunted the darkness, sometimes fading into the low drone of enemy planes, at other times swelling into the thunder of explosions far in the distance. Margaret and Elizabeth slept side by side in narrow beds, the flicker of candlelight casting long shadows on the stone walls. They prayed, they read, they listened to their governess telling them stories of saints and knights, stories meant to distract but never quite succeeding. Margaret was still only a child, yet the war impressed upon her a sense of confinement, a sense that the outside world was both dangerous and forbidden. While other children were evacuated, sent away from the dangers of London, the princesses were kept together, close but cloistered. They were symbols as much as children, their presence in Britain a quiet assurance that the monarchy endured, even in times of fire and fear. And yet even in this time of restraint, Margaret's spirit glimmered. Those who met her remembered the sparkle of her eyes, the quickness of her wit, her delight in song and music. She could play the piano with a touch that surprised adults with its precision, though she often turned serious practice into light-hearted performance. It was as though, from her earliest days, she sensed that she would need brightness to counterbalance the weight of her family's name. One can only wonder what it was like to be a child whose sister was marked for a crown. Did she feel in those early years the stirrings of jealousy, or did she instead feel freedom in being overlooked? The truth may lie somewhere in between, a restless knowledge that she was close to power yet never central, that her life would be measured not by her own deeds alone, but by comparison to the one she stood beside. As the war years pressed on, Margaret grew from a child into a young girl, aware now of her place in the gaze of others. The newspapers printed pictures of the princesses knitting for soldiers, visiting hospitals, smiling politely during official outings. Elizabeth remained composed, careful, the embodiment of duty. Margaret's charm was more playful, more alive, a sparkle that some mistook for frivolity, but which was, perhaps, a quiet rebellion against the solemnity imposed upon her. Windsor Castle in wartime carried with it a peculiar atmosphere. The rooms were cold, the corridors draughty, the great halls silent but for the echo of footsteps. The girls were tutored there, practiced their piano and embroidery, and were told again and again that they were symbols of hope for the nation. Yet beyond the walls, Britain bled. In London, streets were reduced to rubble, and families huddled in underground shelters. Margaret could only imagine this from a distance, a world her position both shielded her from and bound her to. There is something haunting in imagining her peering out of narrow windows, listening to the faint sound of sirens in the distance, and wondering what sort of life lay ahead. Did she already feel the stirrings of rebellion, a desire to live outside the mold of her sister's composure? Or was she still only a child, finding wonder in the flicker of candlelight and the warmth of her sister's hand in the dark? We cannot know. What remains are glimpses, scattered recollections of a girl who laughed more loudly, who sang with greater joy, who charmed her family with mimicry and wit. The war would end. The world would change, and Margaret would step out into society as a young woman destined to be watched, admired, and judged. But before all that, there was only the sound of silence after the sirens, and the weight of a destiny that was not her own pressing faintly at the edges of her childhood. And so the first chapter closes with two sisters lying awake in Windsor Castle, the stone walls around them thick and unyielding, the air heavy with the faint smell of extinguished candles. Outside, the night trembles with sirens, but inside, two young princesses dream uncertain dreams. The flicker of candlelight along Windsor's ancient corridors was more than a source of comfort in those long nights of war. It was also a silent reminder that power lingered just beyond reach, casting shadows as well as light. In those years of blackout curtains and hushed voices, the young Margaret Rose watched her sister Elizabeth change almost imperceptibly. The war was shaping her into something steady, unyielding, the very image of future queenship. Margaret, though still young, sensed the difference. The castle itself seemed to whisper of destinies being carved, one along a straight, solemn path, the other twisting into uncertainty. Elizabeth's transformation was quiet but undeniable. She absorbed the lessons of tutors with measured calm, her posture already upright, her words carefully weighed. Those who came into her presence remarked on her sense of responsibility, as though she carried within her the rhythm of the crown that would one day be hers. Margaret, by contrast, carried music of another kind. She tapped rhythms on windowsills, sang melodies to herself, laughed more easily, and resisted being drawn into the gravity that anchored her sister. Even as a girl, she felt the stirrings of rebellion, though she may not have named it as such. She simply wanted to be different, to shine in a light that was wholly her own. But destiny is not a kind negotiator. In 1936, when their uncle King Edward VIII abdicated the throne for love, the crown shifted with shocking force to their father, who became King George VI. Overnight, the family was transformed. Elizabeth was no longer just a princess. She was heir presumptive, one day to become queen. The world looked at her differently, and so did Margaret. It was as if a silent door had closed, leaving Margaret standing in its shadow, destined always to be the other. How does one grow in such a shadow? The question has haunted many who lived as siblings of power. Some turned inward, some disappeared into obscurity, and some, like Margaret, sought to define themselves by resistance, by carving out space where none seemed offered. From childhood into youth, Margaret discovered that her charm was her shield, her laughter her weapon, and her wit her subtle act of defiance against a system that asked her to exist quietly, without central purpose. During those years, as the war pressed on and then began to ease, Margaret's world was confined but not joyless. She was adored by her parents, doted on by courtiers who found her quickness refreshing, admired by visitors who noted her beauty even in adolescence. She sparkled in conversation, could mimic accents, and had an ear for music that astonished her teachers. Yet behind that brightness was the steady rhythm of comparison. Elizabeth was praised for her seriousness, her diligence, her future role. Margaret was praised for charm, beauty, and liveliness, qualities celebrated in the moment but fleeting, qualities that, over time, can feel like threads slipping through the hand. As the sisters grew older, Windsor became less a refuge and more a stage. The world outside the castle walls was changing rapidly. Britain emerged from the war, scarred but unbroken, its empire fraying but still vast, its people weary but proud. The monarchy became a symbol of resilience, and Elizabeth, quiet and composed, was at its center. Margaret, too, was part of this image, but always as the second figure, the glittering accompaniment, rather than the main melody. She played the role with grace, even joy, but one wonders whether she already felt the confinement of it. Was she aware, as a teenager, that her destiny was to be forever measured against her sister's crown? Or did she still imagine possibilities untethered from that heavy fate? There are memories of those years when the sisters walked the grounds together. Elizabeth's steps steady, Margaret's lighter, more impulsive, often breaking into sudden laughter. Some recalled how she teased her sister, trying to draw a smile, and how Elizabeth, though affectionate, remained composed, unwilling to stray far from her solemnity. The contrast was already clear, and it would only deepen with time. The one chosen by history to embody continuity, the other marked by the restless desire to escape it. The years after the war brought new experiences. Public appearances increased, and the young princesses became figures of fascination. Crowds cheered as they waved, photographers captured their every movement, and newspapers printed their images alongside hopeful headlines of renewal. Britain needed symbols of youth, beauty, and endurance. Elizabeth represented stability. Margaret represented sparkle. and together they seemed the perfect image of monarchy reborn. Yet behind those smiles lay the seeds of conflict. For Margaret, to be celebrated for her vivacity was both a gift and a curse. She was admired but not essential, adored but not empowered. One might imagine her lying awake at night in her chambers at Windsor, candlelight still flickering on stone walls, asking questions only she could hear. Was her role to forever stand beside her sister? Was her fate to bring light and beauty, while Elizabeth bore the weight of crowns and duty? Or might there be some other destiny waiting, something that would allow her to live not just as the second, but as herself? The years of adolescence are always complex, filled with longing and uncertainty. But for Margaret, they were made heavier by the knowledge of history pressing close. She belonged to a family that embodied tradition, yet her spirit leaned toward defiance. She was taught to bow to duty, yet her heart stirred toward freedom. The contradictions would follow her through every stage of life, shaping her joys and her sorrows, her triumphs and her falls. And so the candlelight of Windsor burned on, casting shadows that grew longer with each passing year. Elizabeth walked steadily into her destiny, already wearing the invisible weight of a crown. Margaret followed in her wake, sparkling, laughing, restless, already searching for a way to step outside the lines drawn for her. The castle stood silent, its great halls filled with echoes of footsteps and whispered lessons, its windows opening onto a nation rebuilding itself. And within those walls, a young princess dreamed uncertain dreams, torn between duty and the longing to be free. The flickering flame trembled, casting uncertain shadows, and in its glow we see the contrast of two sisters, one bound by destiny, the other restless in its shadow. The air was still, heavy with the scent of extinguished wax, as though holding its breath for what was yet to come. The scent of extinguished wax lingered in the corridors of Windsor long after the candles had died, and yet beyond those stone walls, the world was quickening into light once more. The war had ended, the streets of London filled again with people who walked not in fear but in fragile hope, and Britain entered a time of rebuilding that was both weary and expectant. Into this atmosphere stepped the younger princess, Margaret Rose, no longer a child protected by walls of stone, but a young woman of beauty and allure, eager to taste the air of freedom that seemed to drift just beyond her reach. The newspapers began to take notice of her in earnest. Photographers who once captured images of two solemn sisters now trained their lenses more keenly upon Margaret. She dazzled, though not with the gravity of Elizabeth, but with something more elusive, a vitality, a charm, a hint of rebellion that made her seem both royal and entirely apart from royalty. Her features were delicate, yet striking, her dark hair framing a face that could shift easily from mischief to solemnity. Admirers whispered that she had the kind of beauty that caught one by surprise, lingering in the mind not because it was perfect, but because it was alive. At public appearances, she stood beside her sister, smiling, bowing, performing her duties with grace. Yet her presence was not the same as Elizabeth's. Where the elder sister was a steady flame, Margaret was a spark. She laughed more easily, her voice carried farther, her gaze often seemed to hold secrets. Young men noticed her, society watched her, and whispers began to follow her wherever she went. She became, in those years, not just the second princess, but a figure of fascination, a symbol of modernity brushing against ancient tradition. The post-war years were a strange season for Britain. Rationing lingered, cities bore scars of bombs, yet there was also hunger for glamour, for music, for fashion, for some glimpse of joy after so much loss. Margaret embodied that hunger. She loved music, played the piano with skill, and could often be found at gatherings where laughter and song filled the air. She smoked cigarettes in long holders, sipped cocktails, and wore gowns that sparkled in the light. In her, the public saw both the old image of monarchy and something entirely new, something alive with modern spirit. But beneath this glitter, there was also loneliness. For Elizabeth, the future was clear, laid out like a path of stone that stretched ahead. For Margaret, the way forward was less certain. She was admired. She was watched. But what role was she to play? Was she destined to be an ornament at court, a figure of fascination but not of power? Or was there a different kind of destiny waiting, one that would test the fragile boundaries of duty and desire? Suitors began to gather, as they always do around royal daughters. Some were earnest, others ambitious, and still others merely dazzled by her beauty. She enjoyed the attention, perhaps even needed it, for it affirmed her identity as something more than a shadow beside her sister. Yet none seemed to stir in her the kind of deep feeling that might anchor her restless heart. She danced, she laughed, she charmed, but the echo of the question remained: what was her place, if not upon the throne? In the evenings, when the glamour faded and the laughter subsided, she returned to her rooms, where silence lingered like a patient guest. Perhaps in those moments she reflected on the differences between herself and Elizabeth. One had duty, the other freedom. But was freedom truly freedom when it came without purpose, without recognition, without a path? The post-war London of the late 1940s and early 1950s offered temptation as well as confinement. There were theaters filled with music, jazz clubs alive with sound, fashionable parties where artists and writers mingled with aristocrats. Margaret's presence in such places was noted, sometimes celebrated, sometimes criticized. She belonged to a family that valued restraint, yet her spirit leaned toward the new and unrestrained. In her laughter, one might hear the faintest echo of rebellion, not shouted but whispered, as if she was testing how far she could go before the invisible cords of expectation pulled her back. Those who observed her closely remarked on her contradictions. She could be dazzling and charming, yet quick to sharpness when she felt slighted. She could laugh loudly, then withdraw into silence. She seemed at once eager for attention and burdened by it, both liberated and confined. These contradictions would remain with her throughout her life, shaping her relationships, her choices, her joys, and her sorrows. At this time, her closeness with Elizabeth remained strong. They had shared so much in childhood: nursery games, wartime confinement, whispered prayers in the dark. Yet their paths were beginning to diverge. Elizabeth was preparing for marriage to Philip, a union that promised stability and continuity. Margaret, in contrast, stood on the threshold of society with no clear path, only possibilities that shimmered like mirages. Their bond was real, but it was also tinged now with the subtle awareness that their destinies were no longer intertwined in the same way. One can almost see Margaret at a grand reception, the chandeliers glittering above, the air filled with the rustle of gowns and the murmur of polite conversation. Elizabeth, serene and composed, standing beside her, already marked by the dignity of a queen-in-waiting, and Margaret beside her, radiant but restless, her eyes scanning the room, her smile hinting at secrets, her spirit yearning for something beyond the constraints of tradition. It was in this world of admiration and uncertainty that she would first meet the man who would define her destiny, at least for a time. A tall figure in uniform, his gaze steady, his presence quiet yet commanding. Their paths crossed, and with that crossing, the next chapter of her life began, a chapter filled with longing, controversy, and heartbreak. For in Peter Townsend, Margaret would find not just affection, but the echo of freedom she had long sought, only to discover how unforgiving the monarchy could be to those who dared to follow their heart. But for now, in these early post-war years, she was still the dazzling princess of London's society, admired by many, restless within herself, standing at the edge of a life that promised glamour and sorrow in equal measure. The chandeliers glimmered, the music played, and somewhere across the room, a glance was exchanged that would alter everything. Across that crowded hall, with chandeliers shimmering and laughter curling into the air, the glance was brief, almost unremarkable to the many who gathered there. Yet for Margaret, it carried a quiet weight. The tall man in uniform, composed, reserved, his eyes steady and unflinching, was Group Captain Peter Townsend. An equerry to her father, he was often present in the background of royal life, unobtrusive, polite, a figure whose presence was steady but not clamorous. In those early meetings, there was no dramatic spark, no instant declaration of destiny. There was only a sense of calm, a stillness that contrasted with the restless energy that often defined Margaret's spirit. Townsend was everything she was not. He was measured, quiet, shaped by years of military service. He had flown in the Battle of Britain, endured fear, loss, and the relentless strain of duty. His face bore a soldier's composure, his demeanor one of restraint. Beside him, Margaret's laughter seemed brighter, her movements livelier, her words more playful. And yet perhaps it was precisely this difference that drew her to him. In a life filled with glitter, noise, and constant eyes upon her, his steadiness was like a hidden harbor, a place of rest she had never known. Their affection grew slowly, almost secretly, nurtured in glances and conversations that lingered longer than necessary. He was married at the time, a fact that ensured discretion, though his marriage was already troubled and unraveling. Margaret, young and untested in the deeper ways of love, found in him a figure who offered not only affection, but also a vision of stability that her own life lacked. In his presence, the restless spark within her seemed to quiet, if only for a moment. The war had left deep scars upon Townsend, as it had upon so many men of his generation. He was not a dreamer, but a man who had seen death close, who understood sacrifice. Perhaps this was part of what Margaret found in him, a depth born of hardship, a gravity that contrasted with the shallow adoration of courtiers and socialites. For once, she was not the dazzling princess who must amuse and charm. She could simply be Margaret, a young woman in love. The secrecy of their bond gave it both sweetness and sorrow. They could not move openly in the world as other couples might. Their meetings were stolen, their words guarded. Within palace walls, whispers were easy to ignite, and the eyes of courtiers were always alert. Yet the more they concealed, the more powerful the attachment became. It is often so with forbidden love that secrecy feeds the fire rather than extinguishing it. Margaret, who had lived her life surrounded by watchfulness, found herself now complicit in that watchfulness, protecting a love she knew others would not approve. Townsend's divorce came in 1952, a year of profound change for the royal family. King George VI, Margaret's beloved father, died after years of ill health, and Elizabeth ascended the throne as queen. The crown, which had always loomed like a shadow, was now a living reality for her sister. The court grew heavier with protocol, the eyes of the world fixed more sharply upon the Windsors. And it was in this very moment of transition, when duty became weightier than ever, that Margaret's love for Townsend became undeniable. She was in her early 20s, beautiful, admired, restless. He was 16 years older, divorced, and though loyal in service, not of her world. Their bond, tender yet firm, could not help but clash with the expectations of monarchy. For though Britain itself was changing, the Church of England and the government clung tightly to traditions that left little room for a princess to marry a divorced man. Elizabeth, bound by duty, could not easily support the match, even as a sister. The government, wary of scandal, whispered warnings. The press, sensing a story, circled like birds above uncertain waters. And yet Margaret loved him. This much is clear. She loved him not with the playful flirtation of her youth, but with the seriousness that comes when one sees in another the promise of belonging. Perhaps she saw in him the stability she never had, the calm she never knew, the simple possibility of a life lived beyond the stage. Yet she must also have sensed that her love, if pursued, would come at a cost greater than most are asked to pay. The letters between them, those that survive, speak of affection, of longing, of an intimacy that was genuine. But the love was also marked by silence, by the impossibility of open declaration. Margaret could not speak freely, could not act freely, and each day brought the tightening of invisible cords around her. The monarchy, the church, the state, all pressed in, reminding her that her life was not her own. What does it mean to love when love itself is forbidden? For some, it means surrender, a quiet ending. For Margaret, it meant a deepening of desire, for she was not a woman who easily bowed to command. The very impossibility of the union made it burn brighter within her. Perhaps she even imagined defiance, imagined stepping beyond the crown's shadow to claim a life of her own choosing. Yet at the same time, she was a daughter of duty, raised in the traditions of monarchy, bound by loyalty to her sister the Queen. To choose Townsend would mean not just love, but defiance of the crown, of Elizabeth herself. The tension grew unbearable. By 1953, when Elizabeth was crowned in Westminster Abbey, Margaret stood beside her, radiant in appearance, yet torn within. The weight of history pressed on Elizabeth's head in the form of a crown, but Margaret bore a quieter weight, the weight of choice, of love restrained, of a heart pulled between freedom and loyalty. The world saw only the image of unity, two sisters together in splendor. Few guessed at the conflict that simmered unseen. In quiet moments, Margaret and Townsend spoke of a future together. They dreamed, perhaps, of a cottage away from court, a simpler life of music, of children, of peace. But such dreams were fragile against the machinery of monarchy. The government made clear its resistance, the church declared its refusal, and Elizabeth herself, bound by her role, could offer sympathy but not sanction. Margaret stood at a threshold few could envy. To choose love was to abandon privilege, position, and the expectations of her family. To deny love was to surrender a part of herself that might never return. The world around her pressed for an answer, yet she lingered, torn between heart and crown. And so, the letters remained folded, some sent, some unsent, carrying words that could never be spoken aloud in court. Margaret, once the sparkling princess of society, now became the silent figure of longing, her laughter dimmed, her restlessness sharpened into sorrow. The forbidden love that had once brought light now weighed heavily, like a secret she could neither reveal nor release. The story did not yet resolve. The letters remained, the glances lingered, the silence deepened. Outside, the world celebrated a young queen crowned, but inside, in the quiet chambers of palace life, Margaret sat alone, holding a letter folded but unsent, her fingers tracing words she could not bring herself to speak. The letter lay folded, unsent, its edges soft from being held too often, its ink blurred slightly by the brush of a fingertip. In that fragile paper lived both hope and despair, for it carried words Margaret could not utter aloud, promises she could not make real, a future that shimmered and faded like mist. Outside her chamber, the bells of London tolled with their eternal rhythm, marking the steady passage of time, yet for her each strike seemed to echo the narrowing of her choices. To marry the man she loved would mean defying the weight of crown, church, and government. To relinquish him would mean surrendering the deepest part of herself. Few choices in life carry such cost, and fewer still are made under the gaze of an entire nation. By the mid-1950s, the whispers about her attachment to Peter Townsend were no longer mere rumors. They had grown into speculation, printed in newspapers, debated in Parliament, murmured in parlors. The young princess, once adored for her beauty and wit, had become the subject of controversy. Some saw in her desire to marry him the stirrings of modernity, a new era in which love might matter more than protocol. Others saw scandal, the risk of monarchy entangled in divorce, the possibility of instability at a moment when the young Queen Elizabeth's reign had only just begun. Margaret herself was caught in the silence between these voices. She was 25, still radiant, still admired, but wearied by the endless scrutiny. Townsend had been sent abroad on assignment, a deliberate act to create distance, to cool the flames of controversy. But absence did not dissolve love. If anything, it intensified longing, for each mile between them was measured by letters written in secrecy, by words carried across oceans, by dreams of reunion. The government, led by Prime Minister Antony Armstrong-Jones, placed the matter in stark terms. If Margaret chose to marry Townsend, she would be required to give up her rights of succession, her income, her privileges. She would, in essence, exile herself from the royal life she had always known. Some argued this was fair, others saw it as punishment. For Margaret, it was a cruel bind. Was love worth the price of identity, of belonging, of family? The Church, too, was unyielding. The Church of England, of which her sister was now supreme governor, forbade remarriage after divorce while the former spouse still lived. Townsend's ex-wife was alive, remarried, and this single fact stood like a stone wall before them. To marry him was not merely a personal choice, it was a challenge to the religious authority that underpinned the monarchy itself. And what of Elizabeth? The bond between sisters was deep, but the weight of crown rested on the elder. She could not speak freely, could not offer permission that would shake the very foundations of her throne. She was sympathetic, perhaps even sorrowful, but she was also queen. And in her silence, Margaret heard both love and refusal. The world remembers the announcement Margaret eventually made in 1955, a declaration that she would not marry Townsend, that duty to crown and church came before her personal happiness. But what the world does not hear are the countless nights before that moment, the long hours spent staring at the ceiling, the folded letters held close, the muffled sobs that echoed against the silent stone walls. She had come to the edge of freedom, and at the last moment she turned away, bound by cords, invisible yet unbreakable. Was it courage or surrender? Historians debate, biographers speculate, but perhaps the truth is not so simple. Perhaps Margaret herself did not know. To choose love would have been rebellion, yes, but also exile. To choose duty was to preserve family, nation, and crown, yet at the cost of her heart. There was no path that did not wound her, no choice that did not leave scars. When the announcement was made, the world sighed with relief. The monarchy was safe, tradition preserved, scandal avoided. The Queen's reign continued unshaken. Yet in the quiet corners of palace life, Margaret was changed. She smiled still. She laughed. She played her role, but those who looked closely saw a dimming of light. Something within her had closed, like a door that would not open again. The tolling of church bells marked her decision, solemn and resonant. In their sound was triumph for tradition, but also mourning for a love denied. Those who heard them may have thought of continuity, of stability, of monarchy secured. But Margaret must have heard something else, the echo of what might have been, a melody cut short, a harmony that would never be sung. And so she stepped forward into life without Townsend, her path now set not by her own choosing, but by the dictates of crown and church. The world saw her as radiant still, but within her lingered a shadow, the memory of a love lost not through fading affection, but through forces too vast to resist. The letters were put away, the glances ceased, the silence grew final. Yet sorrow has many faces. For some, it quiets the spirit, leading to a life of restraint. For Margaret, it sharpened her hunger for freedom. Denied the one love that promised stability, she turned toward a different kind of defiance, toward the glitter of society, the smoke-filled rooms of artists and writers, the laughter of parties that stretched into dawn. If she could not have love in its purest form, she would have life in all its intensity, however fleeting, however destructive. The bells tolled, the announcement was made, the world moved on. But Margaret carried the memory with her, as one carries the faint scent of extinguished flowers, never fully gone, always lingering. The crown had claimed victory, but it was a victory purchased at the cost of a young woman's heart. And in the silence after the bells, one could almost hear her footsteps, light yet determined, moving away from the path of denied love and toward the restless search for another kind of freedom. Her footsteps carried her away from the tolling bells, away from the weight of announcements written in formal words, and into the restless hum of London evenings where laughter, music, and smoke gathered in thick clouds above crowded rooms. If she could not shape her life by love, then she would shape it by experience, by the gleam of chandeliers, by the murmur of conversations that stretched until dawn. Margaret's sorrow did not lead her to silence. It led her into the world, dazzling and broken, where she could drown the ache of sacrifice in the pleasures of the moment. The London of the mid-1950s was a city in transition, still scarred by war, still rationed in places, yet it had begun to cultivate a new hunger for modernity. Jazz clubs throbbed with rhythm, painters and poets mingled with aristocrats, and the boundaries between tradition and rebellion blurred in smoky air. Margaret entered this world not as an outsider, but as its brightest ornament. She was young, beautiful, royal yet restless. Wherever she appeared, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations faltered, cameras lifted, whispers spread. She carried with her an aura of contradiction, a princess bound by crown, yet determined to live as though she were free. At private gatherings, she sat at pianos, playing with a skill that surprised those who had expected only charm. She sang with a husky warmth that carried through the air, filling rooms with melancholy. Cigarette smoke curled in the glow of lamplight as she leaned back, laughing, her voice carrying above the murmur. Writers admired her, actors adored her, musicians played for her. To them, she was not just a royal. She was a figure of allure, a symbol of possibility, proof that even within the stiff walls of monarchy, rebellion could find a voice. And yet the laughter was often sharper than joy, tinged with defiance, carrying with it an echo of something unsatisfied. Those who looked more closely saw a woman who, for all her brilliance, could never quite escape her shadow. Elizabeth reigned as queen, her life defined by duty and the grandeur of tradition. Margaret sparkled beside her, yet she sparkled with an urgency, as though her light must burn faster, brighter, because it would never be steady. She cultivated friendships with artists, writers, and bohemians, men and women who lived on the edges of convention. In their company, she felt a kind of freedom, for they did not measure her by her lineage, but by her charm, her wit, her ability to match their conversation and their excess. With them, she drank more deeply, smoked more often, stayed out later. The palace disapproved, but Margaret cared little. If she could not have the love she wanted, she would have the life she chose, however scandalous it seemed. There were whispers of new romances, fleeting attachments, flirtations carried on under the curious eyes of the press. None carried the weight of Townsend, but each offered a temporary balm. In the arms of admirers, in the gaze of artists who painted her, in the applause of friends who delighted in her presence, she sought to forget the ache of her denied heart. And yet, in quiet moments, the ache returned, sharper for having been masked. London nights became her refuge. In smoky clubs, the air thick with the sound of saxophones, she could slip into the rhythm of music and feel, for a fleeting moment, that she was just another young woman, alive in the city, free of protocol. The taste of gin, the haze of smoke, the laughter of companions, all were her escape. But when dawn came and the city grew quiet, she returned to palaces where silence pressed against the walls, where duty still lingered, where she was reminded again of who she was and what she was not permitted to be. What is rebellion when it cannot be open? For Margaret, it was in the details, in the tilt of her head as she lit a cigarette, in the sparkle of her eyes when she teased courtiers, in the hours spent among those who lived without fear of scandal. She embodied contradiction, a princess who craved freedom, a royal who loved the company of outsiders, a woman adored by many, yet unable to claim the one love that mattered most. The press followed her closely. Photographs captured her stepping out of cars in gowns that shimmered, laughing at parties, leaning against pianos with a drink in hand. To the public, she became a figure both glamorous and mysterious, a woman who embodied the allure of modern royalty. Some admired her as a symbol of change. Others whispered criticism, calling her frivolous, irresponsible, self-indulgent. She was perhaps all of these things at once. Yet behind the glamour, there was an emptiness she could not escape. In her laughter was an echo of loss, in her brightness a shadow. The love she had been denied lingered in memory, shaping her choices even when she tried to forget. Perhaps that is why she pursued life so fiercely, why she embraced excess, why she surrounded herself with those who lived without restraint. She was seeking, always seeking, a freedom that had once seemed within reach and had been torn away. And so the years passed in a blur of smoky rooms, glittering parties, whispered scandals. Margaret remained radiant, her presence always magnetic, yet her heart restless. The palace sighed in disapproval, the press delighted in her contradictions, the public watched with fascination. She was no longer the innocent princess of Windsor, nor the young woman of forbidden love. She was now the rebel royal, carving out a life of glamour and sorrow in equal measure. The sound of jazz echoed through London streets, a soundtrack to her restless search. The night sky above the city seemed always tinged with smoke and light, as though reflecting the duality of her life, glittering and clouded, bright and obscured, and somewhere, in a quiet corner of a room, as the music faded and the laughter subsided, Margaret sat with a cigarette in hand, gazing into the distance, her eyes carrying both sparkle and shadow. The jazz notes lingered, faint in the air, unresolved, like a question without an answer, as if waiting for the next chapter to unfold. The last notes of jazz faded into silence, their echo clinging to the smoky air like a ghost unwilling to depart. And in that silence entered a figure who would alter the course of Margaret's restless journey. He did not arrive with the fanfare of aristocracy or the solemnity of courtiers. He came instead with a camera slung across his shoulder, an artist's eye behind his lens, and an ambition that stretched far beyond the frames he composed. Antony Armstrong-Jones was his name, though in time the world would know him as Lord Snowdon. He was not of royal blood, not bound by tradition, yet he carried with him a sharp intelligence, a quickness of wit, and the allure of a man who could both see and capture the essence of those before him. Their meeting was not the stuff of fairy tales, not the chance encounter of romance novels. It was a sitting, an appointment arranged to capture her image. Margaret, accustomed to being watched, posed as she always did, elegant, poised, aware of her beauty. But behind Armstrong-Jones's camera was not the gaze of a courtier or a journalist. It was the gaze of an artist, one who sought not the perfect image, but the truth hidden beneath it. His lens lingered, searching, questioning, and in that moment Margaret felt something stir, to be seen not as a princess, not as a symbol, but as a woman. Was this not what she had longed for all along? Antony was unlike the men of her world. He was restless, daring, unbound by convention. He moved among artists, designers, writers, and musicians, living at the edge of society where tradition was questioned and rules bent until they broke. In his company, Margaret discovered once again the thrill of rebellion, but now with the promise of partnership. He did not stand above her, demanding she conform to his world. He invited her into it, and in doing so, offered her the chance to step outside the confines of the palace once more. Their courtship was swift, fueled by secrecy and desire. The press, eager for stories, speculated on Margaret's movements, but few guessed the seriousness of the bond forming behind closed doors. To some, Antony seemed an unlikely match, common in birth compared to the circles Margaret inhabited. A photographer by trade, living in a loft filled with canvases, cameras, and the clutter of creativity. Yet perhaps it was precisely this that drew her to him. After the loss of Townsend, after the glitter of parties that had left her hollow, here was a man who offered not stability, but intensity, not calm, but fire. When their engagement was announced in 1960, it stunned many. The public, who had mourned her lost love, now turned their eyes toward this surprising choice. Some rejoiced at the thought of Margaret finding happiness at last. Others whispered doubts about the suitability of such a match. The palace, weary of scandal, embraced the announcement with cautious approval, for at least it offered a resolution to years of speculation. The wedding, held at Westminster Abbey, was the first royal wedding to be broadcast on television, a spectacle witnessed by millions. Margaret arrived radiant, her gown shimmering in the light, her smile both dazzling and enigmatic. As she walked down the aisle, the world watched a princess who seemed at last to have claimed a life of her own choosing. The music swelled, the bells rang, and for a moment, the past shadows seemed to lift. Yet even in the splendor of that day, there were whispers of unease. For those who knew Antony well, he was as ambitious as he was charming, as restless as he was devoted. His world was not one of quiet fidelity, but of constant movement, constant seeking. He thrived on novelty, on the thrill of creation, on the allure of new faces. Margaret, equally restless, equally hungry for intensity, might have found in him both a mirror and a rival. Their union was less the merging of calm souls and more the collision of flames. The early years of their marriage sparkled with glamour. They entertained lavishly, their circle filled with artists, actors, and aristocrats. Photographs of the couple appeared in magazines, capturing their style, their elegance, their aura of modern royalty. Margaret was admired for her fashion, her poise, her ability to embody both tradition and rebellion. Antony, with his camera and his sharp tongue, became a figure of fascination in his own right. Together they seemed to embody a new age, one in which monarchy was no longer only about solemnity, but also about glamour, creativity, and modern spirit. Yet beneath the sparkle, tensions brewed. Both Margaret and Antony were strong-willed, both demanded attention, both craved freedom. Their arguments, whispered behind closed doors, carried the weight of two restless spirits colliding. For Margaret, who had once surrendered love for duty, marriage was meant to be a sanctuary, a place of belonging. For Antony, marriage was another stage, another arena for performance. They loved, they quarreled, they reconciled, and they quarreled again, their life together a pendulum swinging between passion and discord. Still, in those first years, The world saw only the brilliance. They posed together, they traveled, they shone in public. Margaret, once the Princess of Sorrow, now appeared the Princess of Style. She became a fashion icon, her dresses copied, her presence admired. To the public, she seemed at last fulfilled. To those who looked closer, the shadow of restlessness remained. Perhaps it was inevitable that two such restless spirits could not remain in harmony. The cracks would widen. The passion that drew them together would also drive them apart. But for now, in the early glow of marriage, the sound that lingered was not of argument, but of a camera shutter clicking, capturing fleeting moments of glamour that would endure in memory even as the reality behind them grew fragile. And so the music of jazz gave way to the click of a shutter, each image freezing a moment of beauty, even as life itself remained in motion, unresolved, uncertain. The shutter clicked again and again, freezing her smile, her tilt of the head, the poise of her hand as though the world might believe in permanence if enough images were taken. But photographs do not reveal the silences between moments, nor the distance that can grow between two people who once burned brightly. Behind the framed images of elegance, the marriage of Margaret and Antony Armstrong-Jones was beginning to fray, each argument pulling at threads that could no longer be easily mended. Their union, born of intensity, carried within it the seeds of discord. Both were restless, both unwilling to yield, both craving more than the other could provide. At first their quarrels were sharp bursts of passion, followed by reconciliation. But as years passed, the quarrels deepened into habit. Antony's world of photography, of studios filled with models and assistants, placed him constantly in the company of others who admired him, who stirred his ambition, who captured his wandering attention. Margaret, though radiant in public, grew increasingly aware of absences, of whispers, of the truth that her husband's gaze was often directed elsewhere. She, too, sought escape. Where once she had laughed easily, now her laughter was edged with bitterness. Where once she had been content to sparkle at parties, now she used those gatherings as armor, drowning discontent in music, smoke, and drink. Yet even this failed to quiet the ache. The palace was no refuge. Its corridors felt cold, its formalities suffocating. London society offered glamour but little comfort, and so she looked further afield, across the sea, toward an island whose waves whispered promises of freedom. Mustique was little known when Margaret first set her eyes upon it, a small jewel in the Caribbean, wrapped in turquoise waters and fringed with palms. To most it was remote, inaccessible, but to Margaret it became sanctuary. There, away from the rigid gaze of London, she could shed the weight of duty and inhabit a different self. The air was heavy with the scent of salt and hibiscus, the nights filled with the sound of waves breaking gently on the shore. In Mustique she found what the palace could not offer: privacy, liberation, a stage where she could live not as a princess, but as a woman. It was there she built her villa, Les Jolies Eaux, a house open to the sea, filled with sunlight and laughter. Friends gathered there, actors, musicians, artists, those who shared her hunger for life without boundaries. Parties spilled into dawn, with music drifting across the sand and glasses clinking under the stars. On the island, Margaret was no longer confined to the role of the Queen's sister. She was hostess, sovereign of her own domain, free to love, to laugh, to forget. But even paradise cannot erase what lies within. The marriage to Antony continued to unravel. Both took lovers, their affairs whispered about, photographed, printed in headlines that mingled fascination with disapproval. The public, once enamored of their glamour, now watched with sharpened interest as their union cracked. Margaret's name was linked with younger men, her images splashed across tabloids, her private life dissected as though it belonged not to her, but to the nation. Antony, too, pursued his own paths, his attention scattered, his presence often distant. Loneliness, sharper now than in her youth, became Margaret's companion. Even in the midst of laughter on Moustique, even surrounded by friends and admirers, she carried within her a hollow space. The love she had once lost, the stability she had once yearned for, seemed now further than ever. She had chosen passion, chosen freedom, yet both had led her into turmoil. And still she sought, reaching for moments of brightness, however fleeting, as though to remind herself that she still lived, still felt, still could defy the silence that threatened to consume her. Those who visited Moustique recalled her charm, her wit, her ability to command attention. She could dominate a room with a glance, silence a conversation with a single cutting remark, or fill the air with laughter that seemed boundless. Yet those same visitors, in quieter moments, saw her staring out at the sea, cigarette in hand, her gaze fixed on the horizon. It was as though the endless water spoke to her of something she could not reach, something always slipping away. The island became her refuge, but also her escape, a place where time itself seemed suspended. In London, duty pressed, scandals brewed, and the monarchy remained unyielding. On Moustique, the days unfolded in sunlit ease, the nights in music and secrecy. The contrast grew sharper each year, the split between her public role and her private self more difficult to bridge. Antony, increasingly absent, increasingly estranged, seemed to inhabit a different life altogether. Their children, David and Sarah, brought moments of joy, grounding her in the reality of motherhood. She loved them, yet even in this role she struggled, her restlessness often at odds with the constancy children required. Still, they remained her deepest bond, reminders of love untainted by disappointment, anchors amid the drifting tide. The unraveling of her marriage became undeniable, yet for years it lingered in a state of half-truth, neither wholly intact nor wholly broken. The press speculated, friends whispered, but the official image was maintained. Only later, when the rift grew too wide to conceal, would the truth emerge in public, marking her as the first royal in centuries to divorce. But that moment lay still ahead. For now, there was only the widening gap, the growing silences, the restless search for solace in the crash of Caribbean waves. At night, when the music ended and the last glass was emptied, Margaret often stood alone on the veranda of her villa, the sea stretching endlessly before her. The air was heavy with salt, the stars bright above, and the sound of the surf unceasing. It was there, in that solitude, that she faced the truth of her life. Beloved yet criticized, glamorous yet wounded, free yet bound. She inhaled the smoke of her cigarette, exhaled slowly, and listened to the sea as though it might answer questions she could not voice. And the waves, eternal and unyielding, broke against the shore, carrying secrets back into the depths, leaving only foam and silence in their wake. The waves broke against the shore with their eternal rhythm, carrying secrets back into the deep. But secrets have a way of returning, rising to the surface when least expected. Margaret's island refuge, her beloved Moustique, which had promised silence and privacy, could not shield her forever from the gaze of the world. The sea could conceal whispers, but not photographs. And it was with photographs that scandal found her, sharp and unyielding, scattering her private longings into the hands of strangers. It began with a camera, as it so often does. Margaret, in the company of a man younger than herself, Antony Armstrong-Jones, long absent from her side, was captured in moments of intimacy that were not meant for public eyes. The man was Roddy Llewellyn, a landscape gardener and aspiring singer whose presence in her life brought laughter and tenderness at a time when loneliness weighed heavily. Their bond was not political, not strategic, not bound by duty. It was simply companionship, affection, and the fleeting joy of being seen. But for a princess, even such simplicity was forbidden. The photographs, when published, caused a storm. Margaret in swimsuits lounging by pools, laughing with Roddy beneath the Caribbean sun, images that spoke not of royal composure, but of human longing. Newspapers seized upon them, printing headlines that mingled fascination with disapproval. For the first time in modern memory, a royal was caught not in duty, but in desire, not in dignity, but in scandal. Breakfast tables across Britain were filled with the rustle of papers, the clink of cups, the murmur of voices discussing the fall of the Queen's sister. Some readers were scandalized, appalled that a royal woman could so openly defy tradition. Others, more quietly, sympathized, seeing in Margaret not disgrace, but the inevitable rebellion of a woman denied her own heart for too long. Yet, whatever the judgment, the photographs had stripped away the veil of mystery, leaving her exposed to a world eager for spectacle. For Margaret, the exposure was both wound and release. The secrecy of her island life had been pierced, her refuge invaded, yet there was also a strange honesty in what the world now saw. She had loved Townsend in silence, hidden her heartbreak in smoky rooms, concealed her loneliness behind dazzling gowns. But now the truth was laid bare. She was a woman who sought love, however imperfect, however scandalous, however fleeting. There was no hiding it, no folding it into unsent letters. It was printed in ink, displayed in windows, carried on trains and buses. The monarchy trembled at the scandal, for it was unaccustomed to such exposure. Elizabeth, steady and dutiful, maintained her composure, though one can imagine the sorrow she must have felt for her sister. The courtiers, ever watchful of image, scrambled to contain the damage. But the public had already seen, already judged, already woven the photographs into their understanding of Margaret. Antony Armstrong-Jones, meanwhile, had long been living his own life apart, his affairs no secret to those who knew him. Their marriage, once a dazzling union of modernity and glamour, now lay in fragments. The scandal of Margaret's photographs accelerated what was already inevitable. The divorce, when it came, was both shocking and unsurprising. The first in modern royal history, a break in tradition as profound as any rebellion. For Margaret, the end of her marriage was not liberation, but a heavy silence. She had entered into it with the hope of finding freedom and belonging. She left it marked by betrayal, loneliness, and public judgment. Yet even in this, she remained defiant. She did not retreat entirely, did not disappear into obscurity. She continued to appear in society, continued to host, continued to live with the sparkle that had always defined her. But the sparkle now was sharper, edged with the knowledge of loss and the weight of years. What do we see in those photographs now, long after the scandal has faded? Do we see disgrace or do we see humanity? Do we see a princess who defied her duty, or a woman who longed, like so many, simply to be loved? Perhaps we see both. For Margaret was always both, the royal and the rebel, the woman of privilege and the woman of longing. The rustle of newspapers grew quiet in time, the scandal replaced by new stories, new spectacles. Yet for Margaret, the rustle never ceased. It lingered in her memory, a constant reminder that her life was never hers alone. Even in her most private moments, she was watched, judged, remembered not only for her beauty or her wit, but for her defiance. And so the scandal passed into history, leaving behind its marks, reshaping her image in the eyes of the public. She returned again to Moustique, again to the waves and the silence, but never with the same innocence. The sea still broke against the shore, the air still carried the scent of hibiscus and salt, but now there was always the echo of cameras, the reminder that even the most remote island could not shield her from the eyes of the world. The newspapers lay scattered on breakfast tables, their pages turned, their ink smudged by countless hands. Some readers shook their heads, others smiled knowingly, still others folded the paper in silence. Margaret remained on those pages, captured not as she wished, but as she was found, laughing in the sun, vulnerable in her humanity, a princess whose rebellion had been photographed for all to see. And in the rustle of paper, as cups were set down and voices murmured, her story lingered, unresolved, waiting for the silence of empty corridors to follow. The newspapers, folded and set aside, left behind only the faint smudge of ink on fingertips and the echo of voices that had murmured judgment. In the quiet after scandal, there is not always calm, but often a deeper silence, one that fills the spaces between walls and lingers in corridors where footsteps sound too loudly. Such was the silence that crept into Margaret's life as her marriage finally reached its end. The bond with Antony Armstrong-Jones unraveled beyond repair. The palace, vast and solemn, seemed emptier now, its polished floors reflecting not grandeur, but absence, its corridors echoing with memories of quarrels, reconciliations, and the laughter that once promised permanence. Divorce was no ordinary matter for a princess. It was not simply the dissolution of a union, but the breaking of an image the monarchy had carefully preserved for centuries. Margaret and Antony had been the embodiment of glamour, the symbol of a new age in which royalty could mingle with artists, photographers, and actors. Their parties had shimmered, their portraits adorned magazines, their presence made the monarchy seem less distant. And now, with the divorce finalized in 1978, that image shattered. She was the first royal in modern history to end her marriage. And though society itself was changing, more tolerant of separation, more open to imperfection, within the monarchy, the act remained a rupture, a mark upon tradition. For Margaret, the silence that followed was not the silence of freedom, but of displacement. No longer wife, no longer half of a dazzling pair, she returned to rooms that seemed colder, to duties that felt emptier, to a life that no longer offered even the illusion of belonging. She was still a princess, still admired, still photographed, yet the admiration was tinged now with pity, the photographs sharper in their gaze, as though searching for the lines of disappointment etched across her face. Her children, David and Sarah, became her anchors in those years, their presence offering glimpses of joy untainted by the judgment of society. With them, she laughed more easily, played more freely, discovered moments of tenderness that reminded her of her own worth beyond the eyes of the world. But motherhood, though grounding, could not entirely shield her from loneliness. The absence of Antony, once a source of quarrel, was now an emptiness she could not entirely fill. The palace did not know how to treat a divorced princess. She remained royal, yet her image was complicated. Some courtiers preferred she fade into the background, that she limit her public presence to avoid further scandal. Margaret, however, was not one to fade. She continued to appear, continued to sparkle, continued to assert her presence in society. If the corridors of the palace grew silent, she sought sound elsewhere, in theaters, in parties, in conversations that stretched into night. Yet even in these gatherings, something had changed. The laughter that once carried easily now seemed forced at times, the sparkle in her eyes shadowed by fatigue. The years of excess, drink, smoke, late nights, began to leave their mark. Friends who had once marveled at her wit now whispered of her weariness. Admirers who had once delighted in her presence now noted the fragility behind the glamour. Margaret was still beautiful, still magnetic, but her radiance was no longer untouched. It was tinged with sorrow, a brilliance edged with the knowledge of loss. Her role within the royal family grew more ambiguous. Elizabeth reigned with steadiness, her image one of constancy and composure. Margaret, by contrast, embodied contradiction, royal yet rebellious, glamorous yet wounded. Some saw her as a liability, others as a necessary reminder that the monarchy, for all its formality, was not immune to human frailty. Perhaps this was her unspoken contribution, to reveal that even within palaces, hearts could break, choices could wound, and lives could unravel. The empty corridors of the palace became a symbol of her inner state. She wandered them, not in despair, but in restlessness, as though searching for something she could not name. The silence pressed upon her, reminding her of decisions made and paths closed. She had chosen duty over Townsend, passion over caution, defiance over restraint. Each choice had brought with it both light and shadow, and now, in the aftermath of divorce, she carried them all within her. What is left to a woman who has lived so brightly when the brightness dims? For Margaret, the answer was not withdrawal, but persistence. She continued to live, to seek, to shine, even when the shine no longer concealed the cracks. She smoked, she drank, she laughed, she quarreled. She remained herself, unapologetic, unyielding, unwilling to disappear into silence. Yet the silence of the palace remained, heavy, inescapable. In those long nights when the parties ended, when the music faded, when the sea lay far away and the corridors stretched empty, she sat alone with the weight of her choices. Perhaps she wondered if Townsend's quiet devotion would have given her more peace. Perhaps she longed for the simplicity of Mustique's waves, for the laughter of her children when they were small. Perhaps she simply sat in silence, cigarette smoke curling in the air, listening to the echo of her own breath. The world outside moved on. Scandal gave way to new stories, new faces. Margaret remained a figure of fascination, but no longer at the center of the storm. She was still present, still remembered, but now in a quieter way. Her story less about rebellion and more about endurance. The silence of empty corridors became not just the background of her life, but the atmosphere in which she moved. And in that silence, the sound of footsteps, her own, echoed faintly, as though reminding her that she still walked, still lived, still carried within her the unresolved story of a woman both bound and defiant. The echo lingered, fading into the distance, unresolved, waiting for the next turn of her restless journey. The echo of her footsteps down the empty palace corridors dissolved into the hush of late evenings, where the glow of a single lamp revealed smoke curling upward in restless spirals. It was the late 1970s now, and the world was changing quickly. Britain itself seemed to stagger beneath economic strains and shifting culture, while within the monarchy the crown remained steady on Elizabeth's head. Margaret, by contrast, found herself caught between presence and obscurity, her name still recognized, her figure still admired, yet her role increasingly unclear. She was no longer the dazzling young princess of promise, nor the scandalous wife at the center of fascination. She was instead something less easily defined, a woman both visible and invisible, celebrated and dismissed, remembered yet fading. The society that once orbited around her had begun to move elsewhere. New faces, younger and brighter, filled the clubs and salons where she had once been sovereign. Photographers turned their lenses toward new stars, singers and actresses who embodied the shifting styles of the decade. Margaret, still glamorous, still magnetic, continued to attend, to host, to mingle. Yet the energy was different now. Her laughter, once the spark of gatherings, carried a sharper edge. Her wit, once refreshing, now sometimes seemed cutting, defensive, as though she sensed the shifting tide and resisted it with every remark. And still, the smoke curled in those dimly lit rooms, cigarettes between her fingers, glasses half filled beside her chair. The haze of excess surrounded her. Friends who visited noted her brilliance remained, but they also noticed her weariness. She was no longer untouched by time. The lines of strain, the fatigue in her eyes, the rasp in her voice, they were marks of a woman who had lived too intensely, who had sought too often to drown sorrow in pleasure. Yet even in decline, she captivated. People could not look away. Margaret was not one to vanish quietly, not one to fade into gentle obscurity. She continued to command attention, whether through her style, her sharp tongue, or her mere presence. At parties, even when her laughter faltered, people watched her as though expecting at any moment the brilliance of her younger self to reappear. And sometimes it did. In flashes, in moments, she reminded them all of why she had once enchanted a generation. The sparkle of her eyes, the elegance of her movements, the sudden warmth of her smile. These glimpses were enough to sustain the fascination, enough to remind the world that Margaret still lived as both symbol and enigma. Her relationships in these years reflected her restless spirit. She drew close to younger men, companions who offered not permanence, but the fleeting comfort of attention. To some, this seemed scandalous. To others, it was simply Margaret being Margaret, refusing to surrender her desires to convention. Yet beneath the gossip was a deeper truth. She was still searching, still yearning for the affection and belonging that had eluded her since Townsend. Each new attachment was both hope and illusion, a brief spark in the darkness that faded as quickly as it appeared. Within the royal family, her place was complex. Elizabeth, ever dutiful, maintained composure and authority, her reign steady through turbulent times. Margaret, by contrast, embodied something the monarchy struggled to reconcile: imperfection, vulnerability, rebellion. She was both a burden and a symbol, proof that royalty could err, could suffer, could seek escape. In a way, she humanized the crown, though often at her own expense. The press continued to follow her, though now with less reverence. Headlines shifted in tone, less about admiration, more about decline. Photographs showed her smoking, her eyes tired, her figure heavier with age. Critics spoke of wasted potential, of glamour soured into indulgence. Admirers, though fewer, still defended her, remembering her as the brilliant young princess who had once defied the world for love. Yet through it all, Margaret remained herself. She did not retreat into seclusion, did not surrender to silence. She continued to appear, to laugh, to smoke, to drink, to love. Her defiance was not always dramatic, but often quiet. The simple insistence on living as she chose, even when the world judged her for it. In this way, she remained consistent to the spirit she had carried since childhood. The spark beside the flame, the one who would not be bound entirely by duty. But time has a way of insisting on its presence. Her health began to falter, the years of excess carving their toll. Friends worried, doctors advised, but Margaret resisted change. She had always lived intensely, and she would not suddenly temper herself now. Still, the signs were there. The cough that lingered, the fatigue that deepened, the faint tremor in her hands. She was no longer invincible, no longer the radiant figure who lit up rooms effortlessly. And though she concealed it with wit and style, those closest to her could see the decline beginning. In the quiet of her private rooms, when the laughter of gatherings had faded, she sat surrounded by smoke that hung heavy in the air. Perhaps she thought of her past, of Townsend's quiet devotion, of Antony's camera shutter, of the waves at Mustique, of her children's laughter when they were young. Perhaps she thought of her sister, burdened with the crown, living a life defined by duty. Perhaps she wondered whether her own rebellion had been worth the cost, or whether it had been only another form of bondage. The rooms grew dimmer, the air thicker, the sound of her breathing more labored. Yet still she endured, still she sought brightness, still she carried within her the contradiction that defined her. She was both princess and exile, both celebrated and criticized, both alive in her defiance and marked by her wounds. and as the night deepened, smoke curling upward, the sound of laughter distant, the image remained of Margaret sitting alone in a dimly lit room, her figure half hidden by shadows, her gaze turned towards something unseen. The silence pressed close, but she remained, unyielding, unresolved, a flame that flickered but did not yet go out. The smoke curled higher, its spirals dissolving into the dark, leaving only the faint glow of a cigarette and the memory of a woman still searching in the twilight of her years. The smoke lingered in the air until it dissolved into the stillness. And in that stillness, the clock struck midnight, its sound echoing through the quiet as though to remind her of the passage of hours she could not reclaim. Midnight is a curious hour, neither night nor morning, poised between exhaustion and possibility. For Margaret, it became the hour most familiar, when gatherings ended, when silence returned, when longing grew sharper. It was in those midnight hours that her choices seemed most fragile, her laughter most hollow, her search for companionship most urgent. In the years after her divorce, she continued to seek affection, often in the arms of younger men whose vitality reminded her of the youth slipping quietly from her own grasp. Roddy Llewellyn, whose presence had once brought her joy beneath the Caribbean sun, remained a tender companion for a time. He was gentle, affectionate, uncomplicated, and in his youth she rediscovered the laughter of earlier days. Yet the world did not allow the simplicity of their bond. To many he was a scandal, too young, too ordinary, too far from the expectations of a royal consort. The press mocked, courtiers disapproved, voices whispered, but Margaret cared little. For her, Roddy was not a scandal but a balm, a reminder that she could still be desired, still be loved for herself rather than her title. Other companions followed, some fleeting, some more enduring, all bound by the same thread of impermanence. They offered distraction, affection, the warmth of presence against loneliness, yet none could truly anchor her. The passing of time became sharper with each new attachment, each new reminder that youth was no longer hers, that she was chasing echoes rather than beginnings. The midnight clock struck louder, its sound deepening with each year, its echo carrying the truth she could not silence. Margaret's beauty, once the envy of a generation, began to soften with age. The lines of laughter and sorrow etched themselves on her face. The sparkle in her eyes dimmed, though it never disappeared entirely. She dressed still with elegance, still commanded attention, still carried herself with the poise of a princess. Yet the cameras were less forgiving, their lenses capturing not only glamour, but decline. Photographs that once celebrated her style now scrutinized her fragility. Headlines shifted from admiration to speculation about her health, her excess, her fading place in the world, and yet she remained defiant. She smoked still, despite warnings. She drank still, despite caution. She loved still, despite scandal. Margaret had always lived intensely, and age did not soften her spirit. If anything, it sharpened it, making her more insistent, more unwilling to surrender. She would not go gently into the silence of obscurity. She would laugh. She would argue. She would sparkle, even if the sparkle was edged with defiance rather than innocence. The midnight hours carried both melancholy and allure. In them she felt the ache of years lost, but also the thrill of rebellion still alive. Friends recalled her as unpredictable, at times radiant, filling rooms with her presence, at times withdrawn, her mood heavy as though shadowed by memories she could not shake. She was capable of immense warmth, but also of sudden sharpness, her tongue quick, her words cutting. Perhaps it was her way of shielding herself, of defending against the truth of decline. To keep others at a distance was to maintain control, even as time eroded it. Roddy eventually moved on, seeking a life of his own, one not defined by the impossible burden of loving a princess. His departure left her wounded, not only for the loss of affection but for what it represented, that even love, when found, could not remain. Others came, others went, yet none filled the hollow space that had been hers since Townsend, since the first love denied her. It was as though every attachment after him was only an echo, a reflection distorted by time and circumstance. Margaret's nights grew heavier with drink, her mornings slower, her health increasingly frail. Yet still she dressed for appearances, still attended gatherings, still played her role. Those who met her continued to feel her magnetism. Even in decline, she could command a room, could silence conversation with her entrance, could ignite laughter with a remark. Her allure had not vanished. It had merely become tinged with tragedy. She was admired not only for her beauty, but for her defiance, for her refusal to surrender entirely, for her insistence on living on her own terms. And yet, beneath it all, the midnight clock continued its toll. Time reminded her of what was slipping, of what was lost, of what could not be regained. She had once been the dazzling princess of society, the woman whose beauty and wit made headlines. Now she was a woman in her 40s, then 50s, her health fragile, her role uncertain, her life a patchwork of brilliance and sorrow. Midnight became less a moment of possibility and more a reminder of decline, the hour when the silence pressed too close, when memories returned too vividly, when the sea of mystique whispered faintly but remained far away. What is it to grow older when one's youth was lived so brightly, so intensely, so publicly? For Margaret, it was to feel the contrast more painfully than most. Ordinary women age quietly, their changes witnessed only by those close to them. Margaret aged before the world, her decline photographed, analyzed, discussed. She could not simply grow older. She had to endure the judgment of those who had adored her youth. Midnight, in its quiet cruelty, reminded her of this truth again and again. And so she lived in those hours, between brilliance and shadow, between laughter and silence, between the warmth of companionship and the chill of solitude. Each midnight carried the echo of clocks, of fading music, of footsteps departing. Each midnight carried the reminder that time was a companion she could not charm, could not defy, could not escape. The clock struck once more, its sound deep, resonant, unresolved, and Margaret, cigarette in hand, sat in the half-light, her gaze turned toward the window. Beyond it, the night stretched endlessly, stars faint in the distance, the silence heavy. She exhaled smoke slowly, as though releasing her sorrow into the darkness, and listened to the ticking of time, relentless, unyielding, drawing her further into years she could neither change nor resist. The sound of midnight lingered, a toll fading into silence, unresolved, carrying her forward into the fragile dawn of decline. The toll of midnight faded into silence, but the silence was not empty. It was filled with the sound of breath, uneven and strained, a reminder that time does not merely pass, it leaves its mark. Margaret's body, once lithe and radiant, now bore the scars of excess. The cigarettes that had so long been her companions, the glasses lifted too often in smoky rooms, the nights stretched into dawn, all these had woven themselves into her flesh, her lungs, her heart. The decline that had whispered at the edges now stepped fully into view, undeniable, insistent. It began with small things, a weariness she could not shake, a heaviness in her limbs, the cough that lingered. Friends remarked upon it, doctors cautioned, but Margaret brushed them aside, unwilling to bow to frailty. She had lived her life in defiance, and she would not easily surrender to weakness. Yet the body cares little for defiance. Its laws are not swayed by wit or will. By the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Margaret's health faltered more visibly. Strokes weakened her, each one stealing a little of her strength, each one reminding her of mortality. Those who had known her as the vibrant princess whose laughter once filled rooms now saw a woman slowed, her movements measured, her speech sometimes halting. The photographs that captured her youth in dazzling light now revealed her decline without mercy. Where once she had been a symbol of rebellion, now she was seen as the emblem of consequences, of what happens when defiance collides with time. Yet even in this, she retained a certain dignity, a refusal to collapse entirely into despair. There is something profoundly human in such decline, something both humbling and haunting. Margaret, who had been denied her first love, who had sought escape in passion and glamour, who had lived with an intensity that few could match, now faced the reality that no amount of rebellion could hold back the toll of years. The illness that weakened her body was not sudden, but gradual, a slow erosion that left her more fragile with each passing season. She withdrew somewhat from the dazzling circles that had once defined her, though not entirely. Even in frailty she appeared when she could, dressed with care, her head held high, as though to remind the world that she was still present, still Margaret. Yet her presence was now tinged with fragility, her sparkle dimmed though not extinguished. Admirers, once captivated by her beauty, now spoke of her resilience, her courage in facing decline. Critics, less forgiving, saw only the consequences of indulgence. But the truth, as always with Margaret, was more complicated. She was both, victim of excess and bearer of endurance, weakened by her choices, yet defined by her refusal to surrender. At home, the nights grew quieter. The smoky rooms where laughter once rose into dawn now gave way to hours of rest interrupted by discomfort, by the weight of breath, by the silence of illness. The midnight clock struck still, but now its toll was accompanied by the sound of labored breathing, the echo of fragility. Moustique, her island refuge, remained in her memory, a place of freedom and youth. But visits grew rarer, journeys more difficult, her world narrowing to the rooms of her residence and the care of attendants. Her children remained her comfort. David and Sarah, now grown, offered her moments of connection, reminders that love persisted beyond scandal, beyond decline. Their presence softened the loneliness that had long marked her life. In their affection, she found something steady, something untainted by the judgments of the world. Yet even with them, the distance of her own restless spirit lingered. Margaret had never been easy to know fully, never willing to yield entirely even to those closest to her. The press, ever hungry, chronicled her decline with the same eagerness with which they had once celebrated her glamour. Photographs of her in a wheelchair, of her frail figure, of her once beautiful face marked by illness, filled pages that decades earlier had proclaimed her a style icon. There is cruelty in such scrutiny, the way the world delights in both rise and fall. Margaret bore it with a mix of pride and resignation, for she had long known that her life was never her own. And yet, even in frailty, there were moments of brilliance. Visitors recalled her wit remained sharp, her tongue capable of cutting remarks that silenced rooms. She could still command attention with a glance, could still remind those around her that she was no ordinary woman. The decline did not erase her essence. It merely reframed it, revealing a woman who, though wounded, remained unbroken. In quieter hours, perhaps she reflected on her choices, her loves, her rebellions. Perhaps she wondered what life might have been had she chosen differently. Had she defied the crown for Townsend? Had she resisted the excesses that later consumed her? Or perhaps she refused such reflection, choosing instead to live even in frailty as she always had, without apology, without regret spoken aloud. The truth remains hidden, known only to her. The sound of labored breathing filled the nights now, a rhythm as steady as the midnight clock, yet heavier, more haunting. It was the sound of a body yielding, of time asserting itself, of rebellion reaching its limit. And still she endured, still she carried herself with the dignity of a woman who had lived as she chose, however imperfectly, and as her breath rasped in the quiet, the room filled with the faint smell of smoke still clinging to the air, the reminder of years that had shaped her, years that could not be undone. Outside, the world moved forward, but within her chambers the sound of her breathing marked a slower rhythm, one that carried her further into the twilight of her years. The breath lingered, uneven, unresolved, a sound both fragile and defiant, as though each inhalation was a refusal to let go, each exhalation a reminder that she still remained. Her breathing lingered in the quiet, a rhythm fragile and unsteady, and yet it continued. There was irony in her survival, for Margaret endured where others might have faded more swiftly. She had lived with such intensity, consumed drink and smoke with such abandon, courted scandal with such persistence, that many expected her flame to be extinguished long before its time. Yet still she lived, though altered, diminished, slowed. Her body bore the cost of her defiance, her spirit showed the weight of years, but she remained, a presence at once undeniable and increasingly set aside. Within the royal family, her role had grown uncertain, almost spectral. Once she had been at the center of fascination, the glamorous sister, the rebel royal, the figure who embodied both allure and danger. Now she appeared less often, and when she did, her presence carried more sorrow than sparkle. At official events, she was wheeled in or supported gently, her frailty visible to all. The crowds who once gasped at her beauty now murmured with pity, their applause softer, their gaze less dazzled. She was still a princess, still part of the family's public image, but no longer essential. She had become a symbol of fragility, of decline, of the inescapable toll of time. And yet even sidelined, she retained an aura. Those who sat beside her spoke of her wit, still sharp as a blade, capable of cutting through the polite murmur of courtiers with a single remark. In her eyes there remained a flicker of the old defiance, as if to remind all that she was still Margaret, still the woman who had once dared to want what she could not have, still the sister who had lived in shadow but refused to disappear. There was irony, too, in how her survival contrasted with the image of her youth. She had once been seen as the fragile one, too impulsive, too indulgent, too vulnerable to endure the burdens of royal life. Elizabeth, steady and dutiful, seemed unbreakable, while Margaret seemed destined to break. Yet it was Elizabeth who bore the endless weight of crown, year after year, while Margaret, though diminished, lingered on at the edges. She had chosen rebellion over duty, and still she survived, as if to mock the predictions of those who had long ago dismissed her as incapable of endurance. But survival is not the same as fulfillment. Margaret's later years were marked less by rebellion than by resignation. She lived on, but not in the brilliance of her youth. Her villa at Moustique, once the site of laughter and music, grew quieter, her visits less frequent as her health confined her. The parties that had once made her radiant were now only memories, stories retold by others, echoes of a past she could not reclaim. She spent more time in solitude, her world narrowing to familiar rooms, to windows that framed the changing sky, to the company of attendants and the occasional visitor. There is a peculiar kind of dignity in such survival, a dignity not born of triumph, but of persistence. Margaret's life had not followed the path of stability or serenity. It had been jagged, turbulent, marked by losses and excesses. Yet she remained, and in remaining, she became a figure of contemplation. What does it mean to live long in the shadow of choices that never fade? What does it mean to be remembered less for crowns or achievements than for the human contradictions that defined you? The monarchy itself had shifted by then, moving into a new age, adapting slowly to changing times. The younger generation stepped forward, their faces fresh, their stories new. Margaret watched from the sidelines, present but no longer central. She had once been the symbol of modernity, the princess who embodied a break from rigid tradition. Now she was the elder relative, her story already inscribed in the past, her presence a reminder of history rather than a promise of change. And yet, even in this marginal place, she remained enigmatic. People still spoke of her with fascination, still debated her choices, still wondered whether she had lived in defiance or in despair. Her legacy was not simple, and perhaps that was its power. She could not be reduced to a single narrative, neither cautionary tale nor tragic heroine, neither rebel nor victim alone. She was all of these at once, and more. In her private hours, the weight of this ambiguity must have pressed upon her. She had once longed to escape the shadow of her sister, yet she had never fully succeeded. She had once sought to define herself through love, yet love had always eluded her grasp. She had once embraced rebellion, yet rebellion had brought not freedom, but isolation. And still she endured. Still she survived, as though caught in a paradox she could neither resolve nor escape. The window in her room stood open one evening, the wind carrying with it the scent of rain and the distant sound of branches stirring. She sat near it, her figure cloaked in shadows, her breath uneven but steady. The air pressed in, cool and insistent, and for a moment it seemed to her that the world outside was alive in a way she could no longer be. With a motion of her hand, she gestured for the window to be closed. The pane swung shut with a faint thud, shutting out the wind, the scent, the sounds. The room grew still once more, sealed against the world, a chamber of silence where only the faint rasp of her breath remained. The window closed, the air stilled, the silence thickened, unresolved, as though waiting for another chapter yet to come. The window was closed, the room sealed against the wind, and in that stillness the sound that lingered was softer, more intimate, the quiet turning of a diary page. Paper against paper, the faintest rustle, as though memory itself were being unfolded. Margaret never kept a diary with the discipline of her sister, yet her life was recorded all the same, in newspapers, in photographs, in whispers carried by others. Each page turned by time revealed not only her own story, but the shadow of another. For Margaret's life could never be told without reference to Elizabeth. Theirs was a tale of two sisters, bound by blood yet divided by fate, one destined to reign, the other destined to live always in comparison. Elizabeth had become the embodiment of duty, her crown a symbol of constancy in a world that shifted endlessly. Her reign carried her through wars, crises, scandals, and celebrations, always with the same poise, the same careful composure. She was steady, unyielding, her image preserved in ritual and order. Margaret, by contrast, was the embodiment of rebellion, her life marked not by constancy but by rupture, not by order but by longing. Together they represented two poles of the monarchy, the crown and its shadow, duty and defiance, restraint and desire. The contrast was not born of hostility but of inevitability. Margaret adored her sister, and Elizabeth loved her in return. But their lives diverged in ways that affection could not bridge. The very structure of monarchy demanded it. Elizabeth's every choice was subsumed into the preservation of the crown. Margaret's every choice was scrutinized as potential threat or scandal. The throne gave Elizabeth clarity of purpose. The absence of such destiny left Margaret restless, seeking meaning in love, in glamour, in rebellion. Those who observed them often remarked on the difference. Elizabeth, serene, her words measured, her movements controlled. Margaret, sparkling, her laughter quick, her remarks sharp, her presence unpredictable. One could not imagine Elizabeth in smoky clubs, surrounded by artists and actors. One could not imagine Margaret bowing her spirit entirely to the solemn weight of crown. Each, in her own way, was true to herself, yet their truths diverged so starkly that comparison became inevitable. And in those comparisons, Margaret always appeared as the other, the one who did not embody duty but resisted it, the one who did not preserve the monarchy but tested it. In quieter hours, perhaps Margaret turned the thought over like a diary page. Did she envy Elizabeth her destiny, or pity her? Did she long for the clarity of purpose that the crown provided, or did she cherish the freedom, however painful, of not being bound so tightly? She had once told a friend, half in jest, half in seriousness, that being queen must be the most boring job in the world. And yet one wonders if, beneath the wit, there was also a trace of regret, a sense that her own life, unmoored from duty, had drifted too often into sorrow. The monarchy itself seemed to need both sisters, though it did not always admit it. Elizabeth represented the ideal, the unyielding image of constancy. Margaret represented the real, the flawed, the human, the one who showed that even royals are vulnerable to desire, to weakness, to longing. Without Margaret, the crown might have seemed too distant, too inhuman. With her, it became complicated, paradoxical, more like life itself. Yet this role came at a cost, and the cost was borne by Margaret alone. The diary pages turned, one after another, each filled with contrasts. Elizabeth at coronations, Margaret at parties. Elizabeth in solemn photographs, Margaret in candid shots of laughter or scandal. Elizabeth with Philip, her marriage enduring despite trials. Margaret with Antony, her marriage broken beneath the weight of passion and infidelity. Elizabeth steady in age, Margaret fragile in decline. The contrast was stark, almost cruel, as though history itself delighted in the juxtaposition. And yet, for all the differences, their bond endured. In public they appeared together rarely, but in private they remained sisters, bound not only by duty but by affection that survived even the greatest divergence. When Margaret's health declined, Elizabeth visited her, concerned, tender in her own restrained way. When critics derided Margaret's choices, Elizabeth rarely spoke against her, maintaining silence but offering private loyalty. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of Margaret's life was not that she lived in her sister's shadow, but that she could never fully step beyond it, even in love, even in rebellion. What is it to live always in comparison? For some it breeds jealousy, for others despair. For Margaret it seemed to breed restlessness, the constant need to assert herself, to define herself, to live more brightly because she knew she would never reign. Each love she sought, each scandal she embraced, each cigarette lit in defiance, all were, in some sense, a response to the crown that was not hers, the destiny that was her sister's alone. And still, the diary pages turned, the story unfolded, unresolved. Margaret's life, measured against Elizabeth's, seemed at times a tale of rebellion punished, at other times a tale of humanity revealed. Was she a tragic figure, undone by choices and circumstances beyond her control? Or was she a necessary counterpoint, the one who carried the burdens of imperfection so that her sister might carry the burden of perfection? The questions linger without answer as the pages rustle softly in the silence. A page turned once more, and the sound was faint, unresolved, leaving only the image of paper shifting in still air, waiting for what the next entry might reveal. The page turned, and in its wake lay the faint shimmer of sequins scattered across a dressing table, glinting in the lamplight as though tiny fragments of stars had fallen into her room. Margaret sat before the mirror, her reflection softened by the glow, her fingers moving idly among brushes, powders, and jewels. It was here, in such private rituals, that the outer shell of glamour was assembled. The painted lips, the perfectly arranged hair, the carefully chosen gown. Each element spoke not only of vanity but of necessity, for Margaret had long known that image was her shield, her stage, her inheritance. She was not destined to wear a crown of gold, but she could wear crowns of beauty, of style, of allure. And in this she excelled. From her youth she had been admired for her elegance, her ability to make even the simplest dress appear regal. She was not tall, yet her posture gave the impression of height. She was not a queen, yet she dressed as one who understood the power of presence. Fashion designers adored her. Photographers sought her. Women copied her gowns and hairstyles. She became, in the 1950s and 1960s, an icon not merely of royalty, but of modern style, bridging tradition and the new spirit of the age. Where Elizabeth represented continuity, Margaret represented change. Shorter hemlines, bolder colors, gowns that shimmered with daring. The monarchy, often criticized for being out of touch, gained through her an unexpected modern face. Margaret's image in glossy magazines, her photographs at film premieres, her presence at art exhibitions, all suggested that royalty could be both glamorous and contemporary. She brought with her a sense of vitality, of sophistication, of connection to the cultural currents of her time. This was her contribution, though rarely acknowledged openly. She made the monarchy fashionable. Yet beneath the sequins, beneath the shimmer, was always the question of cost. Style can dazzle, but it cannot heal. Fashion can distract, but it cannot fulfill. For Margaret, image was both armor and prison. She knew the world admired her beauty, but beauty fades. She knew the world praised her elegance, but elegance alone does not bring peace. She could command attention in any room, but when the room emptied, she was left alone with her own reflection. The sequins scattered like reminders of fragments that could not be gathered into wholeness. Her dressing table became a stage in miniature, a place where the performance of Margaret the Princess was prepared. The gowns chosen, the jewels clasped, the hair perfected. These were costumes as much as attire, the outward signs of a role she played for the world. She understood the power of this role, but she also understood its hollowness. To be admired for image alone was to be adored for something that was not entirely real, something that could slip away with time. Perhaps this was why she clung so fiercely to her style, why she insisted on maintaining elegance even as her health declined. To surrender style would be to surrender identity itself. The press adored her fashion, but they also weaponized it. Headlines praised her daring, then criticized her extravagance. Photographs showcased her gowns, then mocked her indulgence. She was both muse and target, celebrated and scorned in equal measure. And through it all, she continued to dress, to dazzle, to perform, as though to say that even in decline, she would not give the world the satisfaction of seeing her undone. There is something profoundly symbolic in this. Margaret, denied the role of monarch, created instead the role of icon. She could not rule a nation, but she could rule a room. She could not shape policy, but she could shape style. She could not command armies, but she could command gazes. It was a form of power, though fleeting, though fragile, though often misunderstood. At times, perhaps, she wondered whether this power was enough. To be remembered for gowns and jewels, for the tilt of her head and the cut of her dress, was this legacy or illusion? To others, it may have seemed trivial, but for Margaret, it was both expression and survival. In a world where she could not define her life by destiny, she defined it by image. An image, though fragile, endures. Even now, decades later, photographs of her still captivate, still inspire, still carry the allure of a woman who refused to fade quietly. The dressing table, with its scattered sequins, became the altar of this ritual. Each evening she prepared herself not only for the eyes of others, but for the act of becoming Margaret as the world expected her to be. And yet, when the gowns were removed, the jewels set aside, the mirror dimmed, she was left with the question that no costume could answer. Who was she? Beyond the shimmer, beyond the style, beyond the rebellion. The monarchy, in its way, benefited from her contradictions. Margaret made it glamorous, human, flawed, fascinating, yet she bore the burden of this alone. Elizabeth had the dignity of duty. Margaret had the glamour of rebellion. Both roles were necessary, but only one was secure. Style fades, fashion shifts, beauty dims. And so the sequins scattered across her table carried with them not only light, but shadow, not only allure, but fragility. One can imagine her, in later years, sitting before the mirror, cigarette in hand, her reflection softened by age, her jewels still glittering. She touches a necklace, adjusts her hair, applies her lipstick. She smiles faintly, knowing the world will still watch, still judge, still admire. She knows the ritual cannot stop the passage of time, but it can defy it for a moment, for an evening, for a glance caught by a camera. And when the room grows quiet, when the mirror reflects only her own gaze, the sequins still glimmer faintly on the table, like stars scattered across darkness, unresolved, awaiting the next night's ritual. The sequins glimmered faintly on the table as the room grew quiet, and into that quiet came a softer sound, warmer than the clink of jewels or the click of cameras. The laughter of children running down a hallway, their voices high and bright, echoing against the polished floors until they faded into distance. For all the images of glamour and scandal, of rebellion and sorrow, Margaret was also a mother, and it was in this role that her contradictions softened, her wit gentled, her defiance eased into tenderness. David and Sarah, her two children with Antony Armstrong-Jones, were both anchor and mirror for her, reminding her that beyond the gaze of the world, there remained a private bond that belonged to no headline, no photograph, no judgment. Motherhood did not come easily to Margaret, nor could it, for her life was already complicated by expectation, by public scrutiny, by her own restless spirit. She loved her children deeply, but she was not always constant, not always present in the way ordinary mothers might be. Her moods shifted. Her health often kept her distant. Her longing for freedom sometimes pulled her away. Yet those who knew the family closely spoke of the genuine warmth between them, the laughter they shared, the joy she found in their company. David, artistic and sensitive, carried traces of her own restless charm. Sarah, graceful and steady, seemed to inherit some of Elizabeth's composure. In each child, Margaret saw both the continuity of her family and the possibility of new beginnings. In their early years, she delighted in dressing them, in presenting them to the world as part of the modern royal family. Photographs of the children with their mother captured rare glimpses of her unguarded affection, her smile free of calculation, her eyes lit not with defiance, but with love. She read to them, played with them, scolded them when they misbehaved, and in those moments she was not princess or rebel, but simply mother. Yet the shadow of her own restlessness lingered, and as the children grew, they came to understand that their mother was both present and absent, both loving and troubled, both glamorous and fragile. Their father, Antony, with his own artistic temperament and restless ambitions, shared custody after the divorce, and the children learned early the complexity of living between worlds. Yet they adapted, as children often do, and in time both came to see their parents not through the lens of scandal, but with understanding. They loved their mother not despite her flaws, but with them. Sarah would later speak of Margaret with admiration, remembering her wit, her generosity, her creativity. David, too, though more private, carried the influence of his mother's intensity in his own art and life. Margaret's legacy as a mother is not one of perfection, but of humanity. She was not a model of constancy, but she gave her children a kind of honesty rare in royal life, the honesty of imperfection, of vulnerability, of love expressed not always with steadiness, but with authenticity. In her presence, they saw both the burden and the beauty of living beyond expectation. She taught them, perhaps unconsciously, that life is not always a matter of duty alone, that desire and freedom, however costly, are part of the human fabric. In later years, when her health declined, her children remained close, offering comfort and companionship. They visited her, cared for her, stood by her side at public events when she was too frail to walk alone. Their affection was steady, a quiet thread that held her even as other ties frayed. In them, she found the stability she had never secured in love, the continuity she had sought in rebellion. Their laughter, even when it was only remembered, was a balm against loneliness, a reminder that she had created something that endured beyond scandal or style. The monarchy, with its rigid expectations, often reduced family to image, to presentation, to the performance of unity. But within her own small circle, Margaret experienced family as intimacy, as laughter in hallways, as quiet evenings of conversation. These moments, rarely seen by the world, were perhaps the truest of her life. For all her glamour, for all her rebellion, for all her contradictions, it was in the presence of her children that she was most fully herself, stripped of image, grounded in love. And yet, even here, the contrast with Elizabeth was inescapable. Elizabeth's children grew within the framework of duty, their mother always present in her constancy, even if distant in affection. Margaret's children grew within the framework of unpredictability, their mother loving but restless, affectionate yet fragile. Both sisters were mothers, but the roles they played reflected the larger patterns of their lives. One steady, the other turbulent, one defined by crown, the other by defiance. What, then, is legacy? For Margaret, it was not only the photographs or the scandals, not only the gowns or the gossip. It was also the laughter of David and Sarah, the memory of evenings when she read to them, the warmth of their presence as they grew into adulthood. Her children carried her forward, not as symbol, but as memory, not as icon, but as mother. In them, her contradictions softened into continuity, her restlessness into endurance. One imagines her in her later years, frail, seated by a window, her children nearby. Sarah adjusting a blanket around her shoulders, David speaking gently of his work. She listens, nods, smiles faintly, the cigarette no longer between her fingers, the glass no longer by her side, only the presence of her children to fill the silence. For a moment, she is not princess, not rebel, not icon, but simply mother, content in a way she had rarely known before. And when they leave, their laughter still faintly echoing down the hallway, the room grows quiet again. The sequins on the dressing table remain. The mirror reflects only her, but the sound of her children's voices lingers, softer than scandal, brighter than sorrow, unresolved, yet enduring. The laughter faded down the hallway, leaving only echoes in the still air. And then came another sound, gentler yet heavier in meaning, the steady patter of rain against hospital windows. The droplets trace thin lines down the glass, each one reflecting the dim light of sterile corridors, each one a reminder of time measured not in moments of glamour, but in hours of waiting. Margaret, once radiant beneath chandeliers, now lay beneath fluorescent lights, her body weakened, her spirit pressed by illness. The transition from palaces and villas to hospital rooms was not sudden, but gradual. Each stroke, each ailment narrowing her world until it was reduced to the space of a bed, a chair, a window. The decline had been long foreshadowed. Years of cigarettes, of late nights and excess, of rebellion lived not only in spirit, but in habit, now claimed their toll with relentless force. She suffered strokes, each one stealing a measure of her independence, leaving her speech slower, her movements restricted. The woman who once danced through parties, who once commanded rooms with wit and laughter, now struggled to rise, struggled to walk, struggled even to speak as she once did. And yet, even in frailty, she carried herself with remnants of defiance. Nurses recalled her sharpness of tongue remained, her dignity intact, her eyes still capable of a spark that reminded them of who she had been. The rain fell steadily, blurring the world beyond the glass, as though to shield her from a reality she could no longer inhabit. Mystique, with its waves and sun, was distant now, reachable only in memory. The corridors of the palace, the glitter of society, the shutter clicks of photographers, all belonged to another time. Here, in the hush of hospital rooms, there was only the sound of rain, the hum of machines, the quiet footfalls of attendants. Her world, once vast and dazzling, had shrunk to the size of a room where time stretched slowly, measured by drops against glass. Visitors came, of course. Her children, tender and loyal, sat by her side, their presence steady even as her strength faltered. Elizabeth visited, too, the bond of sisterhood enduring to the end. The Queen's composure never wavered, but those who saw her with Margaret in these moments sensed the depth of feeling beneath her calm. They had lived entire lives in parallel, diverging in destiny, converging in affection. Now, in these final years, the contrasts mattered less than the connection. Elizabeth sat by her sister's bed not as sovereign, but as sister, holding her hand, speaking softly, listening as best she could to words slowed by illness. In those silences lay a tenderness beyond duty, beyond crown. The press, merciless in earlier years, now softened their tone. Photographs of Margaret in her wheelchair, frail and aged, were printed with language tinged with pity, even respect. She had become not scandal but story, not rebel but reminder of mortality. The woman who once embodied defiance was now seen as a figure of vulnerability, her life reframed as tragedy. Yet this too was incomplete, for Margaret was never simply one thing. She was not only victim of excess, not only rebel against duty, not only tragic shadow of a queen. She was all of these at once, layered and complex, never fully captured even in decline. The rain continued to fall, soft and unceasing, as though nature itself kept vigil. In the long hours, Margaret may have reflected on her past, on the laughter of her youth, on Townsend's quiet devotion, on Antony's shutter clicking, on Mystique's waves. Or perhaps she did not reflect at all, choosing instead to live in the immediacy of pain and comfort, of care and fatigue. The truth is hidden, as it always was with her. She revealed herself in flashes, in remarks and glances, but much remained within, unspoken, unresolved. Her world grew quieter still. Social circles that once clamored for her presence dwindled. Friends aged, departed, or drifted away. The headlines that once tracked her every movement now appeared only occasionally, marking her decline with brief notes, her presence with fading photographs. She was still remembered, still recognized, but she was no longer the center of fascination. She had become, instead, a memory living within the present, a figure of the past enduring in fragile form. And yet, even in this, she retained a trace of sovereignty. Nurses spoke of her insistence on being addressed with respect, of her desire to maintain dignity even in frailty. She dressed carefully when possible, wore jewels, arranged her hair. The sequins of her dressing table may have been replaced by bottles of medicine, but the ritual of appearance endured. To surrender entirely to illness would have been to deny herself, and Margaret, even in her final decline, would not surrender so easily. The rain against the window slowed, the clouds breaking to reveal a pale, uncertain light. It illuminated her face, lined now with years, but still carrying the imprint of the beauty that had once captivated the world. Visitors saw in her not only the decline, but the trace of the princess she had been, the woman who had once laughed in smoky clubs, who had once stood radiant beside her sister at a coronation, who had once danced beneath the Caribbean stars. That trace, faint but enduring, remained her legacy even in weakness. The rain ceased, leaving droplets clinging to the glass, catching the light like tears that would not fall. The room grew quiet again, filled only with the sound of her breathing, steady yet fragile. The silence was heavy, but it was not empty. It carried with it the weight of a life lived in brilliance and shadow, of choices made and denied, of rebellion that could never be fully silenced. And in that silence, as the light shifted and the day faded once more, the window reflected her figure faintly, her outline blurred by the glass, unresolved, as though she were already becoming memory. Her reflection lingered faintly in the window pane, blurred by droplets that clung like fragile jewels. And then, as though time itself had turned a final page, the sound of a bell tolled across Windsor. It was February of 2002, a winter morning heavy with cloud, when Princess Margaret breathed her last. The bell rang slowly, solemnly, its echo carrying through the gray air, across the castle grounds, through streets lined with bare trees. It was not the thunder of state that marked a sovereign's passing, but a gentler sound, mournful yet subdued, fitting for a woman who had lived in the shadow of a crown, yet carved her own path in rebellion and sorrow. News of her death spread swiftly. Radios carried it, newspapers printed it, voices repeated it in offices, in kitchens, on buses. The younger sister of the Queen, the once dazzling princess of style and scandal, was gone at the age of 71. For many, the news stirred not shock, but reflection. She had been ill for years, her decline visible, her frailty undeniable. Yet her death carried with it the finality of an era, the closing of a story long intertwined with the story of modern monarchy. In the days that followed, tributes poured in. Politicians spoke of her service, her charity work, her devotion to the arts. Friends recalled her wit, her warmth, her generosity. The press, which had once hounded her with merciless scrutiny, now softened its tone, portraying her as a tragic figure, a woman who had lived brightly but paid dearly for her defiance. Photographs of her youth reappeared, her radiant smile, her elegant gowns, her sparkling presence. For a moment, the scandals were set aside, and the world remembered the princess as she had been at her most dazzling. Her funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the same place where so many royal ceremonies had been conducted, where history itself seemed to linger in the stone walls. The Queen, dignified as ever, led her family in mourning. Behind her eyes, one imagines, was not only grief but memory, the memory of a sister with whom she had shared childhood games, wartime nights, whispered secrets in Windsor's corridors. Elizabeth, the crown upon her head, had walked the path of duty. Margaret, the shadow beside her, had walked the path of rebellion. Now, in death, they were joined again in solemn ritual, the bond of sisterhood transcending the differences of their lives. The coffin, draped in flowers, was carried into the chapel, the air heavy with incense and hymns. Those gathered listened in silence as the choir's voices rose, filling the vaulted space with sound that seemed to stretch beyond time. Margaret's children, David and Sarah, walked in sorrow behind their mother, their faces composed, but their eyes betraying grief. They had known her not as princess or icon, but as mother, with all her contradictions, her tenderness, her flaws. For them, this was not the passing of a symbol, but the loss of a presence, woven into their very being. Outside, crowds gathered in respectful quiet. There was no frenzy, no clamor, only stillness. People stood with heads bowed, some holding flowers, others simply present to mark the departure of a figure who had once seemed to embody both glamour and defiance. She had not been universally loved, not universally admired, but she had been unforgettable. Her death, like her life, stirred questions rather than certainties. Was she a rebel undone by her own choices, or a victim of the crown's unyielding demands? Was she a tragic figure, or simply a human one, flawed and searching? The bell tolled again as the coffin was lowered, its sound resonant, carrying both finality and mystery. The life that had once burned so brightly was now complete, sealed in stone and memory. Yet even as the ceremony ended, even as mourners departed, there remained a sense of incompletion. Margaret's story had never resolved neatly. It ended as it had been lived, in contradiction, in ambiguity, in shadow and light. For Elizabeth, the loss was deeply personal. Within weeks, she would lose her mother as well, the Queen Mother, and the weight of double mourning would fall upon her. The crown endured, as it always did, but the private heart of the Queen carried sorrow that no ceremony could conceal. Margaret's death was not only the passing of a sister, but the closing of a chapter in the story of their shared childhood, their bond forged in wartime, their laughter echoing once in Windsor's halls. The world moved forward, as it always does. The headlines faded, new stories emerged, new generations captured attention. But Margaret's image lingered, in photographs, in anecdotes, in the memories of those who had known her. Her life was retold as tragedy, as caution, as rebellion, as humanity. Each retelling carried its own truth, its own interpretation, for she was never a figure who could be captured wholly in one narrative. The bell at Windsor ceased its tolling, leaving only silence in its wake. The stone walls of the chapel held the memory of the hymn. The fragrance of lilies clung to the air. The footsteps of mourners faded. And in that silence, Margaret's presence lingered, not as queen, not as sovereign, but as the rebel royal, the sister who had lived in the shadow of the crown yet never ceased to seek her own light. The distant bell echoed once more in memory, fading into stillness, unresolved, as though even death could not entirely silence her. The bell's final echo faded into silence, and in that silence a single candle flickered, its flame swaying gently as though uncertain whether to burn or to fade. It glowed in the stillness, a fragile light that trembled but did not die, a reminder that some presences linger even after departure. So it was with Margaret. Though her body lay at rest, though her coffin had been lowered, though the rites were complete, her story did not end with death. Her legacy, like the wavering flame, continued to cast light and shadow, never steady, never fully extinguished. What remains of a life so filled with contradiction? Margaret is remembered as the rebel royal, the sister who defied the crown's expectations, who smoked and laughed and loved where she should have been restrained. She is remembered as the glamorous princess, a figure of dazzling style whose gowns shimmered and whose presence captivated. She is remembered, too, as the tragic figure, undone by denied love, by scandal, by illness. Each remembrance carries a fragment of truth, but none contains the whole. For Margaret was never a woman who could be confined to a single narrative. She was many things at once, layered, paradoxical, unresolved. Her legacy is found in the tension between freedom and duty. She showed what it meant to be bound by the crown yet resist its grip, to be royal yet yearn for ordinary love, to be admired yet ache with loneliness. In her defiance, she revealed the humanity of monarchy, exposing its rigid demands and the cost it exacts upon those who cannot or will not conform entirely. In her frailty, she revealed that rebellion carries consequences, that freedom pursued without anchor can become isolation. Yet in her endurance, she revealed resilience, the capacity to live as herself even when the world judged her for it. The candle flickered, casting shadows across the walls, as though reminding us that legacy is never only light. Margaret's story is filled with shadows: lost love, broken marriage, declining health, yet shadows exist only where there is light, and her life contained that as well. Her laughter, her wit, her glamour, her devotion to her children, her moments of tenderness with her sister, these too are part of her legacy, as real as the scandals and sorrows. In remembering Margaret, we are reminded that history is not only crowns and triumphs, not only ceremonies and duty. It is also the quiet ache of human longing, the fragility of choice, the restless pursuit of meaning in lives constrained by expectation. She lived not as a saint nor as a villain, but as a woman whose flaws and brilliance were inseparable. Perhaps that is why she continues to fascinate, why her story endures even now. For in her we see not only royalty, but humanity, vivid, imperfect, unyielding. Elizabeth still reigns in memory, her crown unshaken, her life defined by constancy. Margaret, in contrast, remains the reminder of what it means to live beside the crown, to seek freedom in its shadow, to struggle and to falter, yet never to surrender entirely. Together, their stories form a whole: duty and defiance, constancy and rebellion, crown and candle. Neither is complete without the other. The candle's flame wavered, then steadied, as though to say that memory persists even when time moves forward. Margaret's image persists in photographs that still captivate, in stories retold, in the memories of her children and friends. She lives on not as monarch, but as symbol, not as example of perfection, but as testament to imperfection lived openly. In her contradictions lies her truth, and in her truth lies her legacy. The question lingers, as it always has. Did Margaret pay too dearly for her defiance, or did she live more authentically than if she had conformed? The answer cannot be simple, for her life resists conclusion. Perhaps she paid dearly, yet perhaps she also revealed something essential, that even within palaces, even within the shadow of crowns, hearts remain human, longing remains real, rebellion remains possible. The candle flickered again, its flame bending as though touched by unseen breath, and then righted itself, glowing steady though small. Margaret's story is like that flame, fragile, wavering, uncertain, yet enduring. It reminds us that even in shadows there is light, even in loss there is memory, even in defiance there is truth. She may have lived in the shadow of a sister, but she carved her own presence into history, a presence that cannot be erased. And so the story closes, not with triumph, not with despair, but with the image of a candle burning quietly in the dark, its flame trembling but alive, casting light and shadow that shift across the walls, unresolved, unending, never fully extinguished.